we're going to talk about thyroid gland now. Okay. Oh, totally forgot. And it's going to be under the title of thyroid. But there are 4 problems associated with growth hormone. Actually, for any hormone, there are 2 problems. Too much or too little, right? So for growth hormone, if it's too much and it's during the childhood, that's gigantism. If it's too little during childhood, that's pituitary dwarfism. I have the illustrations, Mini-Me from Austin Powers. The actor, never watched? Bob, the actor, has pituitary dwarfism. Another famous small person, Peter Dinklage, Tyrion Lannister from Game of Thrones, has a different condition. Endocrine-wise, he's fine. He has achondroplasia. His hyaline cartilage doesn't grow appropriately, so bone growth is stunted. Then, in adulthood, complete lack of growth hormone production is rare. You kind of have to whack the thyroid gland, the pituitary gland. It's hard, and so basically, what I'm trying to say is, usually, if you whack the pituitary gland, you're screwed, like on many levels. It's going to be like you're going to be lethargic, you're going to be obese. It's a whole shit show, okay? But there are examples of pituitary tumors which result in overproduction of growth hormone. Tumor even can be benign, but overproduction of growth hormone in adulthood results in acromegaly, enlargement of bones mostly. And most notably, it's going to be bones of the face, arms, hands and feet. Okay, so people have like massive jaws and massive hands. Go ahead.
Can you write that word on the board?
Acromegaly.
I don't know how to spell that.
Huh? Sure, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Good? So we already saw this sequence of events on with the growth hormones as an example, when you have hypothalamus connecting to pituitary and pituitary connecting to some other organ. So I'm going to introduce you to a first true hormonal axis, which is going to be hypothalamus, pituitary, thyroid axis. Okay? And as usual, we're not going to mention the stimulus yet. We're going to figure out the stimulus by looking at the effects. So here's you have hypothalamus, which produces thyrotropin releasing hormone. I'm going to throw the term here, so thyrotropin. So this is the compound word, 2 parts, thyro and tropin. So each part has a meaning. Thyro refers to your thyroid gland, right? What about tropin? Now, generally speaking, in medicine or in physiology, the term tropo means location. So thyrotropin, the word, means that this molecule, the molecule of thyrotropin, is heading to the thyroid gland. Does that make sense? Like, corticotropin means that the molecule is heading to adrenal cortex. We good? So let's go back. Thyrotropin, releasing hormone, acts on the anterior pituitary gland, which in turn releases, now, thyrotropin releasing hormone. What is released? Thyrotropin. Another term for this particular hormone is TSH. Okay? Now, TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay? All these terms are actually quite self-explanatory. Thyroid stimulating hormone means that it stimulates what? It stimulates thyroid gland. And here you've got your thyroid gland, which effectively is stimulated, and it produces thyroid hormone. And for brevity, I'm going to use the acronym TH. Okay? And the effect of thyroid hormone is elevated basal metabolic rate. Okay? Now, if the effect is basal metabolic rate being elevated, what's the stimulus? What's
Metabolic rate.
low BMR? Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so low BMR initiates this whole thing, and then the effect is elevated BMR. Okay, we're good so far? Now, remember, safety check. We need negative feedback loop completed. So, thyroid hormone here itself inhibits the release of these two from anterior pituitary and hypothalamus. Okay, we're good? Now a few questions that I want to ask you. First, what do you think BMR is? What basal metabolic rate is? In your own terms.
Just like your body in homeostasis.
How?
Like your body on homeostasis. Like
Okay,
that's supposed
and
to be
what?
your normal metabolic rate.
Normal metabolic rate, and like, what does it describe? Let's say, okay, let's do it different terms. Let's say I'm going to tell that my BMR is higher than yours. What does that mean quantitatively? Can you put it in some other terms, or anybody else? Can you put it in some other terms? What does that mean? That my BMR, okay, my BMR now is lower than it was 20 years ago. What does that mean?
Metabolism?
My metabolism now is lower, which means what do I use less now? When we talk about metabolism, huh? Yeah. Basal metabolic rate is how much energy you use if you do nothing. Literally nothing. Like you lay flat for 24 hours, you can measure that. That's how it's measured. You lay flat for a certain amount of time, and there are ways to measure how much energy you use over that time. Okay? That makes sense. So yes, basal metabolic rate can be lower, it can be higher. Okay? So what do you think? So let's say, well, we'll get to the clinical importance. So far, the whole axis, does that make sense? That makes sense. Okay. So we're going to digress a little bit from the hormonal regulation here, and we're going to go back and look at how this hormone is made, whether it's, by the way, a growth hormone is water soluble. Okay. This one will be lipid soluble. So the receptor for this one, for thyroid hormone, where it's going to be? Inside the cell, yes, inside the cell. Now, take a look at this. Sorry. So how does this, are those hormones made? So this is your blood, okay, which runs through your thyroid gland. And your thyroid gland has multiple cuboidal follicular cells which serve as a boundary to a colloid field follicle. On the illustration in the notes, you can see there are huge empty spaces. Okay, does that make empty spaces within the thyroid gland? They're not really huge, they're microscopic. Those are called follicles. They're filled with colloid. Okay? Colloid gel, kind of, that is full of the protein called thyroglobulin. So this is what happens. This is how this hormone is produced. When you eat salty foods or seafood, you get a certain amount of iodine. So this iodine is transported into the follicular cells, okay, where it's reduced to iodine molecule. Now, let me announce something. This is not a chemistry class. I'm not asking you to know the reactions. I want you to know the concept, okay? So formulas, whatever. The point is, iodine goes through the follicular cells and it ends up in the follicle. Okay? That makes sense? In the follicle, iodine engages into the series of chemical reactions with amino acid called tyrosine. Something that I really want you to process here. Check this out. Tyrosine is not just hanging by itself. It's the part of thyroglobulin. The big protein, okay? You with me so far? The outcome of this interaction is that you have thyroglobulin with thyroid hormone hanging off of it. There are like 4 or 5 reactions here, which I honestly wouldn't remember to save my life ever, okay? So I'm not asking this from you. What I want you to understand conceptually. First, the synthesis happens in the follicle. It requires iodine. The initial molecule, the initial source is amino acid tyrosine. What you end up in the end is this now fat-soluble thyroid hormone, which eventually will be chopped off the thyroglobulin and dumped in the blood. Does that make sense? Okay? Now, let's go back to, any questions on this one? Okay, now let's go back to this whole axis and let's discuss some clinical implications, because I know it all sounds pretty boring until we get into the clinical stuff, right? So, higher basal metabolic rate means that a person uses more energy, right? First, if you take, hypothetically, a person with very low levels of thyroid hormone, hypothyroidism, what this person is going to look like? Low basal metabolic rate. What would you expect from a person with low BMR? How would they look like? Huh? Heavier, yes. They will actually be obese, okay? What about blood pressure, say? Huh? Actually opposite, lower. They will be, generally speaking, less active, okay? They will be lethargic, they will be overweight or obese, they're going to have lower blood pressure. Does that make sense? And conversely, if you have someone with higher BMR, okay, what does that mean? It means they're going to be, generally speaking, leaner, okay, more active, higher cardiac output, okay? So, can you, again, not should, but can you use thyroid hormone as the weight control drug? Not asking should you, I'm asking can you. Yes, you can. As a matter of fact, the friend of ours who was an endocrinologist, she says that this is the only hormone that her patients want to be lower than normal. She works down in Louisiana. There's a huge obese population there. When people come to her, they don't want to accept the fact that they're obese because of, lifestyle. They want to be hypothyroid. You see what I'm saying? They want they want the thyroid gland not to work, so it would explain why they're so fat, so they can get thyroid supplements. Does that make sense? Now, there are three conditions, main conditions, associated with a thyroid gland dysfunction, sort of dysfunctions. So those three conditions are dietary goiter, Graves' disease, and Hashimoto's disease. Actually, kind of, to put parallels, Jesus Christ. Thyroid hormone and growth hormone have a lot of things in common. For instance, you can notice that people with obesity also have lower levels of growth hormone for different reasons. If you think about it, obese people, they have higher levels of fatty acids in the blood, which automatically decreases the growth hormone levels. Okay, let's go back to this one. So, let's talk about dietary goiter. Dietary goiter means that in the diet there's not enough iodine. Okay? Now, if you have low dietary iodine, can you make thyroid hormone? You can't. Well, you can't make sufficient amounts, right? So you have low levels of thyroid hormone, correct? Correct? If you have low levels of thyroid hormone, what happens to the levels of TSH and TRH? Up or down? If this is low, this too should be,
High.
High, yes. Sorry, TRH is high, TSH is high. That make sense? Okay, now, can anyone remember what TSH stands for?
Thyroid stimulating.
Yes, thyroid stimulating hormone. So this hormone stimulates thyroid gland. Does that make sense? And sorry for the graphic images, but if you constantly stimulate something, like, you rub something, what's going to happen to it? It's going to grow. Does that make sense? So basically what happens, TSH kind of bugs thyroid gland saying, hey, you need to make more thyroid hormone. The response, it can't just churn out more, it has to become bigger. Still fails to produce, it just becomes bigger due to the constant stimulation. Does that make sense? You with me on this one? So, thyroid gland enlarges. This is where you see, where those pictures come of kids and adults with goiter on the neck. Does that make sense? What's the treatment for goiter? Look at the cause. What causes dietary goiter? Low iodine. So how do you treat dietary goiter? Give them iodine, and it actually will go away. Okay, so that's super simple. This is why you should eat iodized salt, basically. Okay? Make sense? Now, FYI, if you will decide to just drink iodine, it's not going to make your thyroid gland work so much better. Okay? Like, don't do that. Make sense? Okay, now Graves' disease. This is really cool. So we're going to start here. In Graves' disease, it's autoimmune condition in which your immune system produces antibodies that, now check this out, they directly stimulate your thyroid gland. Okay? So you have independent stimulation of thyroid gland. If your thyroid gland is stimulated, what happens to the levels of TH? Say again?
They increase?
Yes, they do. Why I say again? Masks, I'm muting you, so just be louder. When thyroid hormone goes up, what happens to the levels of TSH and TRH?
They decrease.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense? This is called hyperthyroidism. And this is classic clinical picture. Usually TRH is not, TRH can be measured, but usually when a person has a suspected Graves' disease case, they will measure thyroid hormone and TSH. Follow me? And if TH is abnormally high and TSH is abnormally low, that's Graves. People with Graves' disease, how would they look? Lean or fat? Lean or fat?
Lean.
Lean. What about heart rate?
High.
High. Blood pressure?
High.
Irritability? Huh?
High.
Do you know someone with Graves? I used to know a guy. Was a jerk. And I think it was largely dictated by just because he was super energetic. Like, I'd rather have Graves than next one, because he was like running around doing stuff. Okay, that makes sense. Now, another condition is Hashimoto's disease. So in this case, it's also antibodies. But these antibodies, they actually block the function of the thyroid gland. Okay? And when your thyroid gland is inhibited, what happens to the levels of TH? They are what?
Decrease.
Yeah. And TSH and TRH are both
Increase.
elevated. Okay? So this is hypothyroidism. You good? Make sense? So usually these people are these lethargic or slow sorts. Okay? That makes sense? The just complete lack of thyroid function is called myxedema. So okay. One of the interesting features of myxedema, it results in accumulation of fluid in subcutaneous tissues, especially in the face. And people have this swollen faces. I have a photograph of a lady with mixed edema in the notes. One of the students a few years ago called her mean lunch lady. So called mean lunch lady face. Okay, does that make sense? So that's your thyroid function here. Okay, now one thing that I want to briefly mention before we move on to adrenal gland is that there's in addition to follicular cells that I mentioned, there are parafollicular cells in the thyroid gland. They make calcitonin, which is like totally different hormone. We're going to talk about it just separately. Okay? Questions on thyroid?